Hello everyone, this is Nicolina from Marcus Evans. We would like to thank you all for attending today's webinar on solving at-risk trials, identification and mitigation strategies for clinical trial success, brought to you in partnership with Biorasi. Before we begin, I would like to cover a few housekeeping items. As you can see at the bottom of your screen, there are multiple application widgets you can use. All widgets are resizable and movable, so please feel free to move them around to get the most out of your desktop space. You can expand your slide area or maximize it to full screen by clicking on the arrows in the top right corner. If you have any questions during the webinar, you can submit them through the Q&A widget. We will try to answer as many as possible during the webinar, but if a fuller answer is needed or if we run out of time, we'll make sure to follow up with you in a separate email after the webinar. A copy of today's slide deck and additional help materials are available in the resource list. We encourage you to download any resources you may find useful. For the best viewing experience, we recommend using a wired internet connection and closing any programs or browser sessions running in the background. You can find some additional answers to some common technical issues located in the Help widget at the bottom of your screen. Also, a reminder to look out for an email within the next 2 hours with links to download today's material. So without any further delay, let's get started. I'll hand you over now to Kurt.
Hello, this is Kurt Gelson. I'm the Vice President and Chief Scientific Officer at Biorasi. Previously, I've spent most of my entire life as a sponsor on the other end and actually needed to be rescued in the middle of a pivotal Phase 3 registration trial. So I hope you enjoy and learn something from our presentation.
Thank you. And hi, everyone. This is Wayne Bowden. I'm the Vice President of Program Management at Biorasi. In my more than 7 years at the company, where I've had a lot of experience not only in management but also directing, clinical studies, many of those have been rescues. So I've actually participated in about a dozen study rescues across multiple indications, study venues around the world, and of course looking at a ton of different issues from monitoring to data quality and enrollment and compliance. And so I'm happy to be here today and share some of those experiences and lessons learned with everyone here. So we want to kind of take some things in order here as far as the agenda. I want to give a couple of metrics about the industry that are kind of sad, but there's a light at the end of the tunnel. We're going to talk about why studies fail when they do fail, and understanding a concept that Biorasi has coined called return on intervention, which is really important to frame the conversation here. Then we're going to review some of the red flags that you can look for that might indicate that there's some issues with ongoing trials that you may be conducting, and then review some mitigation strategies that are very helpful to think about if you do have to actually implement a rescue, and some case study about some of the prior rescues that Biorasi has done and how those can be successful. So as I mentioned, we're going to start by reviewing a couple of the industry metrics, but we wanted to start with this one that really Biorasi has found through a number of sponsor interviews and roundtables and even our own primary research that we've conducted, and that is that really about 80% of trials are significantly behind in terms of cost or timeline by the end of the study. And so really there's a vast majority of trials out there that can really benefit from an early intervention. And we're going to review a couple of these other metrics on the next slide. So the first metric that we want to review right now is the fact that actually over 30% of all of the active clinical trials going on right now are seriously behind schedule in their timeline of meeting their last major milestone. this is some research that Biorasi did, actually looking at all of the trials that are on clinicaltrials.gov right now and which ones have actually been protracted longer than 3 months from their originally planned date. This is a pretty sad metric, and what's even more important and worse is that we conducted some surveys of those sponsors, and we found that actually only about 10% of those study managers actually sought any significant intervention, even though those trials are seriously behind their schedule. So, really the bottom line here is that in some ways the industry has accepted, that clinical trial conduct means change orders. It means the studies are going to take longer than expected. It means that the study is going to cost more than originally planned. And really, that's something that here at Biorasi we've really sought to change. Kurt, do you have anything to add to this?
Yes, I would say that as a sponsor, most of my life, these things should be unacceptable. Actually, one could imagine that if you're a small biotech company or a small public biotech company, which you have one primary drug, and there's significant delays and failures to meet the objectives and cost overruns, that it could literally tank the company and the drug. So these kinds of things should really be unacceptable, and there's no reason why we can't do better with our clinical trial management.
And before we get into the weeds here, just wanted to really quickly state that, obviously we know that trials can fail for a lot of different reasons. The drug could not work. There could be unforeseen regulatory issues that come up that just delay the trial or put the trial on hold. So there's a lot of other things that go on behind the scenes in drug development. But what we want to talk about today, what we're talking about here really, are those issues that really can be mitigated. Issues with operations, with scheduling and deliverables being on time or late, overruns on the budget that should have been foreseen or at least mitigated if caught earlier, challenges with recruitment that, if the feasibility had done a little bit better or, if there had been more visibility into their recruitment metrics, could have been saved, issues with communication that can be fixed. Those are sort of the things that we want to talk about today. And these are the problems that can really actually, as Kurt mentioned in the prior slide, actually at some cases tank an entire program if the biotech that's running the study can't secure enough funds to keep it going and get over these obstacles. So this is really the thing that we're setting out here to address. And so in the next slides, we're going to talk a little about how we're going to recognize those issues earlier on. And another really important point to make is that, we can all really do everything right, even in terms of planning your study correctly. And I know we all put a lot of work into these studies, not only in the concept and the actual research and development, but even planning for the clinical studies and creating all of the different study plans that are going to guide us. And you can do everything right, but as we all know, running these studies, nothing ever goes exactly as planned. So one of the things that we want to touch on right now is why it's so important to act quickly when things change and when things occur that aren't planned. So I'd actually like to start with a concept that we call return on intervention. And I think this is something that's going to be helpful for us to frame the rest of our conversation here today. And this is also something that we've described in more detail in our white paper called Rescue is Not a Dirty Word. And that's actually available on the resources list in this webinar, so you can go there and you can download it. But return on intervention is very similar to actually return on investment, which we've all heard of. And it's basically the difference between, what you put into any intervention in a trial, so how much you spend in terms of time and cost, and the benefit that you get at the end of the day, once you implement it. And so the first piece of it really is quite simple and straightforward, right? So if we were all starting a trial And at the beginning of this trial, we had a crystal ball, and we knew that it was going to require a rescue down the line. Obviously, we could do something on day one, and we could probably implement an intervention that would completely mitigate the need for that rescue, and your trial would run very smoothly. So the return on intervention at the beginning of the trial is very, very high. But obviously, at the very end of that trial, if you didn't do anything and you waited until the very last day and after the study has been already protracted for a year or more and you finally did something about it, obviously then the return on that intervention is going to be very, very low. So the return on intervention really starts high at the beginning of the trial, and it decreases with time. Now, what's not so intuitive and straightforward is how we perceive, that intervention in real life. So we don't actually have crystal balls, and most of the time when we start a trial, we think it's going to go relatively smoothly, or certainly plan, we plan it to. However, as issues start to pile up, we start to perceive that there may be a need for doing something, and at some point, when things go, bad enough, or there's so many issues in the trial, and the enrollment is delayed, and you're not going to make your database lock, and you're not going to make the top line, results that you promised to all of your superiors. At some point, that perception of risk and the need for intervention gets very, very high. The problem is that could be, nearing the end of the trial, and at that point, it may not make a whole lot of sense to implement something if it's going to take so long for that intervention to actually come to fruition. And what's more is, to exacerbate that issue, we all know that any sort of intervention or rescue that you're going to try to implement in a trial is going to take some time to implement. From the point that you understand that you need to do something, you're going to have to potentially communicate this to your team, find additional partners to help you, and then even contract with those partners, mobilize them, get them familiarized with the study environment, and it's an ongoing study, so that could take some time. So really what makes this even more important to act early is that once you decide that you want to do something, you're going to not have the benefits of doing that something for some time after you decide it. So that's what's so important about this model, is that it really illustrates how important it is to act early and to act with urgency, because once you actually do something, it's going to take time. But more than that, this is what makes it so important to be able to identify what are the risk indicators for needing a rescue earlier on, so that you can actually achieve a higher return on any intervention that you ultimately decide to enact. So let's review some of the early signs and red flags that we can all look out for earlier on in a trial that will make it easier for us to determine when a study is really at risk for failing, and when we should think about potentially intervening in order to save it. So the first early warning sign that we want to review right now is really with site activation. And the reason why this one is first and foremost is because it really is so important. And we've found through our decades of running rescue studies that this is actually the single biggest early indicator for rescue. Even though most of the time it's enrollment that is the symptom, and enrollment is the reason, lower lagging enrollment is usually the reason why at the end of the day some drug developers and study managers will look for some sort of intervention strategy. 9 times out of 10, the root cause is due to the site not actually being activated in a timely manner. And many times when we've come into situations of rescue, what we've actually found is that the enrollment may be lagging behind, but they haven't even gotten all of the sites up. They were planning to have all of the sites up, maybe even sometimes 9 or 10 months prior, but they're still lagging in site activation, and this is why the sites cannot enroll if the sites are not activated. So site activation is a leading indicator of enrollment, and it's the single biggest indicator for study rescue. So it's really important to have a clear site activation timeline. This is also a huge early warning sign. So if the study teams that you're working with aren't able to see or aren't able to predict when the first site should be up, when the last site should be up, but more than that, what is the actual plan and timeline for each individual site to be activated? And you need to have all of those pieces in your plan. It's also important to include the dependencies for the sites, like regulatory approvals and availability of the IP. So things that are outside of the direct site activation timeline, but that are needed in order for a site to be activated. Those things should be included in the plan as a dependency, because if the regulatory approval gets delayed in whatever country you're operating in, then those sites aren't going to be able to get up. And so that's going to impact your enrollment down the line, and those need to be included in the plan. Also, including, one thing is to include some redundancies, because we know that there's going to be some portion of sites, especially in studies with, a very high number of sites, some portion of sites that aren't going to perform as much as maybe you'd plan to. And so including some of those redundancies, extra sites, is really important to ensure that, if something happens down the line, you have that contingency. So those are a couple of things. And then also, really just tracking each of these milestones. And if any of these are missed, that's your first early indicator. So you should definitely have milestones around when the first site is going to be activated, when half of the sites are going to be activated, and when all the sites should be activated. And this should be done on a country-by-country basis. And so that your study team can look at and track this activity. And if any of these are missed, that's your first red flag that down the line something may happen. Here's actually an example of exactly what you would want to see as far as a site activation timeline. This is something that we track very, very diligently at Biorasi to ensure that we ultimately are going to meet the enrollment milestones. It's the plan versus the projected versus the actual site activation curve. So each week or each day, really, we have a plan on when we expect to have any certain number of sites activated, and then we're tracking day by day how many we actually have activated on those days. And the really important part is to look at the difference between these two lines. If your actual plan, or if your actual site activation curve is above your projection, then that's great. But if it's below, then you need to look into a mitigation strategy at the very least, because this could be an early indicator of poor enrollment down the line and potentially needing a rescue. The second category of big risk indicators that we wanted to review is actually the partner engagement, the engagement with the CRO, the engagement with the study site, and other operational issues that you can look out for early on in the program that might indicate some serious issues. The first one that I mentioned, is really communication with the study sites. We all know that the lifeblood of any study is the study enrollment, and for that you absolutely have to have really engaged and capable study sites. And communication with those sites is so important, and not only to have the communication from the CRO, but if there is one, but also from the sponsor. And I know, Kurt, you've had some experiences with this in your life, so maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I would say that for sure, as a sponsor, most of my life, I find that it's incredibly important for the sponsor to also have communication with the sites, with the PIs, with the nurse coordinators and the nurses on the ground. It doesn't need to be as often as the CRO, but it should never be handed off completely to the CRO. And having that direct line of communication at times will also further allow you to identify potential problems that are coming up. And it could be problems with the CRO, it could be problems with the site, but that communication is critical for the sponsor to also be engaged in.
And that's also important because, you know, if the sponsor isn't engaged themselves with the study site, there's really no way for them to know if the CRO is engaged, right, Kurt? So, I mean, they kind of need to be able to balance it off the site. We've had issues, you know, in the past in study rescues where we've come in and transitioning sites over to our team, and we talk to these sites, and they tell us that they haven't really been contacted by the other CRO in months, you know, in some cases. So, you know, that's something that is definitely a red flag because we all know sites. They have a lot of work on their plate. They have, you know, many studies a lot of times running at the same time, and they're simply not going to give attention to a study if nobody is asking them about it, and nobody is putting that study on the top of their list of to-dos for the week. So it really is so important that the CRO and sponsor, whoever is in charge of managing the sites, is keeping an open line of communication, is keeping a very consistent line of communication, because they're going to feel that, and then they're going to be consistent, and they're going to be open, and they're going to be engaged if they have someone who's managing in the same way. And then the other piece of that too, of you know the operational issues, is something that sort of doesn't get a lot of limelight, but it's completion of the study plans. And this is something that we've seen over and over again as a key early indicator. Some of the times in rescue situations, we come in and, you know, we're halfway through enrollment and the monitoring plan hasn't even been completed, right? So this is a plan that's supposed to guide, you know, how we do the monitoring, and it should absolutely be completed before we start monitoring. Otherwise, you know, we're not following a plan. And then other, you know, important plans like the data management plan and the SAP, which could be so important in how we're going to guide the data and statistics, you know, activities. Those need to be completed, and there needs to be tracking systems put in place and a lot of diligence around tracking, you know, these deliverables getting done. And if they're not done on time, and they're not done at least before the first patients are enrolled, then that's a key early indicator that there could be some issues, because planning is so important. And if you're going to move forward with execution without a solid plan, then you really are just asking for trouble. And then Kurt, I know you had a couple. I think you had a situation with monitoring reports as well.
Yeah, I would just add that was the trigger that started our investigation of our CRO during our pivotal phase 3 trial. Was we weren't getting monitoring reports on time, and then it found out that we weren't being monitored. None of the sites were being monitored appropriately, and so that was the huge red flag that started the investigation and then the firing of that particular CRO, and in the middle of a phase 3 pivotal study. So all of this that on this slide is so important. It's really the sponsor's study, and the sponsor really, even though we try to hand these things off at times, especially in this world of virtual development, it's so important that these plans are followed and the sponsor is engaged.
Absolutely. This is actually an example of what we do at Biorasi to help keep ourselves really on track in terms of all those deliverables that I mentioned that don't really get a lot of limelight. We track all of the study tasks completed over time because, as we all know, a lot of times in drug development, any task can be 90% completed in a day, but then the other 10% takes 3 weeks. And so it's really important that we are knocking things off of the list. And this is just one way that we track overall completion of study tasks and make sure that we're always ahead of the curve in terms of getting these studies done and not leaving a lot of tasks undone, no matter how critical or non-critical they seem to be. So this is another really important early sign is the study data cleaning progress. So we all know in the world of pharma, top-line results is so important, especially for small and mid-sized pharma, and you just got to meet those dates. And the top-line results are driven really in large part by meeting database lock timelines. And meeting database lock timelines are driven by cleaning of the data and monitoring of the data in a timely manner. And this is an area that we've seen time and time again in rescue situations where the study data just is not getting cleaned on a continual basis. And so when the sponsor goes to lock the database, and they may have even 4 weeks sometimes to lock these databases, but there's just no way it's going to happen when you have 50% of the data that still needs to be cleaned at the end of the study, or sometimes even more, and SAEs that still need to be resolved from years ago and things like that. So it's just so important to have visibility into the cleaning of the study data and to be able to understand and to know that it is being cleaned as the data is coming in. So some of the things, for example, to look out for is, number one, obviously if the page entry by the site, so it starts at the site, right, with entering data, making sure that there's visibility around there so that you can see if there's a lag or if there's a lot of pages at the site that have not been entered into the EDC. That's an early sign. Obviously the SDV progress, because monitoring is the single biggest, I would say, as far as workload item in a clinical study. And if the monitors aren't out there getting to the data, it's just not something that you can turn around on a dime at the end of the study and get all the data monitored. That's going to take time, and it's going to take a lot of money too. So making sure that STV progress is going on. And if there's a big lag in STV and there's a lot of pages that are out there that aren't STV, that's a really early indicator that something's not right. Querying too, because we've had a lot of situations as well where maybe the data was being STV'd, but it wasn't. The data management teams weren't querying and cleaning the data. So when the sponsor went to go lock the database again, the data management team suddenly then jumped on their computers and started issuing thousands and thousands of queries, and of course that delayed the lock, right? So all of these things are really important to look at. Another big one is SAE resolution and reporting, because as I mentioned, these are things that need to be resolved on time, and it takes so much more time and so much more effort and to try to go and resolve an SAE that occurred a year ago, because the person at the site may no longer even be there. The monitor who is monitoring that may no longer even be on the study, so on and so forth. So it just exacerbates all of these issues if these things aren't done in a timely manner, and you have to wait until the end of the study to do them.
Yeah, I think all of these things are incredibly important, and I found personally in my experience that the queries can be one of the things that it's most simple to address and deal with in real time, even by picking up a telephone. They don't need to be batched and wait for a site visit. They can actually pick up the phone and address a lot of the queries, but waiting until the end can have such a tremendous adverse effect on the timelines and getting the database locked, if even locked, because if you can't resolve the queries, now you're kind of stuck with some unclean data that becomes problematic when you get in front of the FDA or the EMA. And so I find that the queries are one of those critical issues to watch as a sponsor. If the CRO is not addressing them in a timely way, it's something as another one of these red flags that needs to be addressed.
That, and that's really good. And then the other thing, the last bullet point on here is, making sure you even have visibility into these things. So if you're not getting visibility, that alone is a red flag of its own, because that means you're not going to be in a position to be able to fix something when you do see it. This slide, I think, is really important because it's exactly what we're talking about. This is an example of what we ensure that we have to track at Biorasi in every single study. And that's really looking at all those metrics, getting that visibility into site by site, how many pages are entered, how many of those have been SDV'd, how many of those have been reviewed by the data management team, And then obviously the query metrics is a separate graph. But I think this is a graph that as a sponsor, I would just insist, that my partner provides me throughout the study with real-time data, so that we can look at, exactly how each of these metrics are coming in real time, and make sure that we're not falling behind on the data cleaning piece. Another big one that I think is really important, because Biorasi has conducted a lot of roundtables and interviews and things like that. And one of the questions that we ask the sponsors a lot, and when they don't actually get a rescue, so these are cases when things are going wrong with the study and it's protracted and it's behind timelines, but they don't do anything drastic like firing a CRO or getting a different partner. And the reason why is because they say, well, I stepped in and I did the work that I was paying my CRO to do. So I stayed late, I worked weekends, they weren't performing on this, so I took it in my team, and I built out a team to handle this, that, and the other. And so really what we're talking about here is the sponsor burden of management. And one of the early warning signs to look out for is how much time you are expecting to spend on the study as far as managing day-to-day activities versus how much time are you actually spending. Because if you're expecting to not spend so much time because you have partners that are supposed to handle all these issues, but in reality you're spending 10 hours of every day managing these issues yourself, that is a very clear and an important early red flag to look out for. And it's probably something that you, Kurt, have had a lot of experience in.
Yeah, I had experienced this directly. I was in today's environment of virtual development, many companies have set up a model whereby the investors require that everything is outsourced from non-clinical to clinical, even the manufacturing. And with that, this sort of just handing off the work to the CRO can be somewhat problematic. And I was in the same boat. I didn't expect to actually have to build a clinical, regulatory, and safety and manufacturing department, but in fact, as our CRO failed to do what they were contracted to do, I ended up building out the clinical operations group to mirror everything that the CRO was doing or supposed to be doing, and there I've now doubled the cost of my study. The CRO is charging me double for my extra work, and it was one of those things where you just were afraid to pull the trigger for a number of various reasons, even personal reasons, to accept the fact that things were not going very well, and you really need to step up to the plate early. It's not a personal failure to actually have to rescue a trial. It's actually a rather heroic move if you can actually step up to the plate and say, hey, this isn't going well. We need to do something drastic to get back on our timeline and our budget. And so again, for a sponsor, it's a clear sign that things aren't going well when you actually have to start shadowing, monitoring visits, and you're picking up the slack for the CRO.
And a couple of other just ad hoc things to look out for, and some of these obviously are tied to some of the other pieces and elements that we already looked at, but you have to have visibility into your screen failure rates versus, what did you expect to see at the beginning of the study versus what are you actually seeing now. I can say we've had a lot of experiences with this, and I'm thinking of one situation where at the beginning of the study, the screen failure rate was expected to be somewhere along the lines of 30%. But when we came into the fold to rescue the study, we actually saw that it was about 80% screen failure rate. And what was happening was that this was a very complex neurological disorder where the patients had to go through four different screening procedures at 4 different sites through the screening. And what was happening was that because of the logistical scheduling issues between the patient and the site, a lot of eligible patients were being lost because they were actually overshooting their screening window, which was 4 weeks. So you had patients that should have met and did meet all inclusion-exclusion criteria, but were not able to enroll into the study because they just couldn't get to all the sites in time. So what we ended up doing was we ended up spinning up what we call the study navigator group, and that whole group was just dedicated to helping the subjects schedule their visits with the site. And that alone actually dropped the screen failure rate from 80% down to about 35 or 40%. So, whereas the issue looked like it was enrollment, the issue actually was in screening. And the sites, were actually doing, their job as far as identifying patients, but it was just the complex screening procedure that was causing an issue. So looking at that and making sure that you note that as a red flag. And then other things like, obviously missing the major milestones, but, like first patient in and last patient in. But really more important, I think, than even that, than just those single dates, is tracking enrollment and tracking screening, on a plan versus actual, on a continuous basis, and making sure that you take a look at those two lines. And if your actual line is ever below the planned line, then the team needs to have some sort of plan or strategy around how to get back on track. And as soon as that line drops below the planned line, that's your first indicator, and that's when that red flag should hit your desk. Okay, so now that we've sort of reviewed some of the red flags, kind of want to talk about what to do if some of these, if some or many of these red flags appear in your study, because the important thing is that there is still hope. There's things that you can do about it. Every problem has a solution. And so we're going to review some of the things that have worked in the past for us, and hopefully it helps all sponsors in the future if they ever get into a situation that requires a rescue. The single most important thing that we wanted to start with is around urgency, because similar to the return on intervention model that we kind of reviewed at the beginning of the talk here, is that the earlier that you can actually take an action, the more impact that action is going to make in your trial. So having urgency around not only identifying a solution but implementing that solution is probably the most important part of the rescue strategy. I would say too, what's really important is to look for root causes, not just surface issues. So we've given a lot of examples of where, for example, enrollment may look like it's an issue, and in fact, the real issue is a site activation timeline. So when you're planning an intervention strategy, if you think the issue is enrollment and you just think that you can just add 5 more sites and that'll solve the problem, well, if the root cause is site activation, it's not going to solve the problem, because those 5 sites are going to not be activated again for some months because the root cause hasn't been fixed. So it's really important when you're planning a rescue strategy that that you or a partner or your CRO really look and analyze deep into what's happened in the trial, and to identify really what's gone wrong, and try to devise a solution that's going to actually hit the root cause of the issue. And a big help, I think, with this is to get someone outside of the the day-to-day, because we all know when we're running in the middle of these studies, and we've been working on this thing for 12 months, 18 months, 24 months, whatever it is, it's really easy to get tunnel vision. And so I think it's important that you seek, and we don't want to be boiling in our own juices, as we say at Biorasi. So, seeking outside help, someone that's not necessarily involved with the trial. Maybe it's another partner, maybe it's just someone on another project team that you have access to, that can actually look into the details and can give a fresh set of eyes to help develop a solution. Some other things too to kind of consider is that sometimes direct action is the right way, and sometimes it's a real clear a real clear answer and path, and you can fix it right away with something. And other times, it's a little bit more convoluted, and it needs some time to play out. So I think that's really where this building a contingency process, building a rescue plan, and really taking time to identify what the problems are, and then when you've identified what that problem is, that's when you have to have that urgency to go and implement a solution. The first thing that really should be done if you do have a need for a rescue or a major intervention in the study is to develop the plan, the rescue plan. This is something that I think is so important, really, because a lot of the times, the whole reason why the study is not going so well in the first place is because there was a lack of planning that in the beginning, and so the last thing that you want to do is rush out and bring on a bunch of different strategies and things, and then not have plans around implementing those strategies, right? So that would be like pouring gasoline on the fire. So it's really important that whatever strategy is ultimately decided to mitigate whatever issues that you're seeing, that there's a clear plan in place, and that plan is followed, and that whatever partners that you're seeking to bring on board are also given or are empowered with their own plans and executing those plans that should align with your overarching business goals and the goals of the project to hopefully get that project back on track. So planning is a really big issue, and it's also very, very important when implementing a study rescue. And one of the things we do at Biorasi is we actually have a rescue plan, and that includes tools and templates and best practices and everything from each functional area, whether or not there's database migrations that are going to occur, whether or not there's co-monitoring visits that are going to occur, whether or not there's just teleconferences with between the outgoing monitor and the ingoing monitor, and how the monitoring visit reports are going to be tailored and or changed throughout the rescue. So those things all have to go into the plan, and then they have to be executed per the plan. Otherwise, you probably aren't going to have as much success or return on intervention as you'd hoped. So what are the options, in a situation where you've decided that something needs to be done, things aren't going right, and we have to take action in order to get this study back on track, and hopefully that's done earlier on in the study because you've identified some of those red flags that we talked about. There are really kind of three different paths generally that you can take. The first is a very functional or consultative path that doesn't require a whole lot of identification of new partners and doesn't really rock the boat too much in the study, but it's really that engagement of an outside partner to kind of help you identify what are some of the key issues, and hopefully those issues can actually be internally mitigated with the current team that you have. Maybe it's a communication gap, maybe it's maybe it's a logistical gap that can be identified and closed, but something that's relatively straightforward and doesn't require a whole lot of additional resources to put on the study, and hopefully that's the path that you can take. Sometimes that's not enough, and sometimes you actually have to go out and you have to add on a very significant, for example, second CRO, to bring in to take over tasks that aren't being done, or tasks that weren't foreseen and that the other partner isn't able to cover, and so that has to be added to the study. Good example is a lot of the rescues that Biorasi does, we're brought in to bring in additional sites, or potentially in another venue. So the study may be running in all U.S., and there's issues with site activation, there's issues with enrollment, and there's competition in the market and all this kind of stuff that's causing a lot of delays in the study being completed. And we will be brought in to add sites in another country, or even add sites in the same country, but alongside all of the other activities. And then the third, which is really the most, I'd say, drastic measure, but sometimes it's what's absolutely needed, is really a full-scale replacement and transition, where actually whatever partners that you're using, whether it be a CRO or an SMO or something, or a vendor of some sort, that has to be completely replaced by a different vendor because the current partner that you're using is just not engaged and not able to finish the task. And sometimes, this is exactly what is needed in the study to get it back on track. And it's, not anything to be ashamed of that you have to go and necessarily fire a partner like Kurt was saying that he's done many times in the past. But if it's what's needed, then this is an option that has been very, very successful in some of the rescue studies that we've performed. So we're coming a little bit to the end here, and wanted to kind of just review some of a couple case studies of what happens when rescue does go well, and what sort of results that we've been able to achieve for some of the sponsors that we've helped in their studies over the past 6, I think, rescues we looked at, and most of them were enrollment issues, although, like I mentioned, a lot of those were actually site activation issues that had to be fixed. But in the past 6 rescues that Biorasi has performed, we've been able to come in and analyze the situation, develop a tailored rescue plan alongside the sponsor and alongside their current partner, and get that engagement from both teams. And then put in processes in place that really target those root causes and fix those root causes that we're seeing in the study. We've been able to actually achieve 8 times faster enrollment at our site when compared to, on a site per patient per site per month metric when we come into these studies. And so, rescues, this is all to say that, rescues can work. And in all of these cases, we were able to, and many times, bring the sponsors back to their original timelines as far as enrollment. But in some cases, that just wasn't possible. But we were able to shave months or sometimes even years off of the estimated project completion date. With getting these trials done, preventing the sponsor from really hemorrhaging, cost. And so on and so forth. So this is just a few examples of what happens when the sponsor takes a decisive action and seeks help. So Kurt, I don't know if you had anything to add to that.
No, I just think it's so important that people realize as soon as they can that they need help and to take decisive action. Don't put their head in the sand and hope that the CRO will figure it out. It's better to step in, be aggressive, and take control of your study, and if that means bringing in another CRO or doing the things that we've highlighted through the last 30 or 40 minutes, you have to do it. It's just part of the job these days with as complicated as a clinical trial is. The CROs and that particular relationship with the sponsor and the CRO may not be the perfect partnership in the beginning, but you can always fix it.
So what are the key takeaways really from this presentation? I think the first one is, like I said, the title of our white paper is rescue is not a dirty word, and that's exactly what Kurt was just saying. There should be no taboo or shame around having to make a drastic change or add another partner, but there's rather it's sort of heroic to say this isn't going the way that is planned, and I'm going to go do something about it. So this is one of the key takeaways that I think is important to note. And then, 2 and 3 really is number 1, staying engaged with the trial, because there's no way to identify any of those red flags. There's no way to be able to be in a position to make the most on make the most return on an intervention unless you can do so early on in the trial and before things go so bad that they just can't be fixed. And so you can only do that if you're engaged, you're communicating with the sites, You're communicating with your partners on a routine basis. You're managing them, and you're getting the visibility into the key metrics that are going to tell you early on if something's going wrong. And then if you're seeing those red flags, and it's not maybe just one, but you're seeing multiple of these red flags, and it's indicative of something, that's fundamentally wrong, urgency is absolutely critical. Urgency in identifying what a solution could be to get you back on track, and urgency in actually implementing that solution and not letting it just get worse and worse. And then the last piece is to seek that outside help, because you can get a lot of tunnel vision. We've all done it, in the middle of a trial, and to, talk to an expert, not around rescue, but around, trial management and execution, to try to give you that, that third, out-of-the-box view of what's going on. And, Biorasi is, obviously, we're very experienced in study rescues, and we're here, to help, if anyone has any questions. So I just wanted to thank everyone for their attention and thoughts during the presentation, and we're happy to take some questions now and answer any questions you may have around rescue or anything else that we might have, any thoughts that we might have provoked during the presentation.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Kurt, and thank you, Wayne, for sharing this great insight and for being so generous with your time today. I believe we now have some time for a few questions, so let's try to answer as many of those as possible in the time left. If we run out of time, we'll make sure to get back to you in a separate email after the webinar. All right, so the first question that I have here for you, how do the incumbent CROs, project team members, and other vendors react when they are getting rescued? Is there any animosity?
Yeah, that's a good question. So usually there is not. I have been on both sides of the coin where there's been not so good reception by the incumbent, but I would say 80% of the time when we come and do these sort of interventions in a study, we're always there to help the entire project team. We're not there to try to replace anybody. Unless we're specifically that's what we're doing. But generally, when we come into these rescue scenarios, at first we're here just to add to add support and to help the project team succeed. And from that perspective, generally we're welcomed with open arms as an additional resource that can help. Things do get a little bit sticky if it's the third type that I mentioned there on my slides, where it's a full-scale transition. And we've had cases where the incumbent CRO was actually so ready to be rid, quote unquote, of the trial that they were gladly welcoming us with open arms. But we've also had some cases where it did come to them as somewhat of a surprise, and there was a little bit of personal issues that we had to work through. But we've always worked through them. And at the end of the day, again, the message is always, we're here for the good of the trial. It's not about who's doing what necessarily. It's about, coming in and trying to solve whatever issues are at hand. I don't know if you had any experience on that, Kurt. But.
Yeah, I would just add that a lot of the work has to be done between the sponsor and the original CRO as well. I mean, I'm sure, like in my experience, it's not pleasant in the beginning, but as you work through the issues together, most of that softens, and it's really then not any fault of the new CRO to come in, and it really, you have to figure out a way to make sure that everybody works together, because it has to be a very smooth and straightforward handoff. Otherwise, it just creates more problems if it's not taken care of properly.
Yeah, I think one of the things that you can do as a sponsor is as you assess, the need for any intervention, the first thing you should be doing is bringing your current partners in on that assessment, allowing them to mitigate, whatever issues they may be having on their own, and maybe it's a team effort and mitigation on both sides, but bringing them into that process early, so that if and set those expectations, and then if nothing happens and improvement doesn't occur, then when you make a decision to go into a more drastic rescue situation, it shouldn't be a surprise, and that would help certainly with you know I guess lessening any animosity that could come your way.
Interesting. Thank you both. And what if I'm seeing some or many of the red flags that you presented in this webinar? Based on your experience, what are the first steps I should be taking?
Yeah, so obviously, if you're seeing many of those red flags right now, and hopefully it's early enough in the trial so that there's still you can still get a good return on that investment on any potential intervention. Obviously the first steps is to engage either internally your team, but also potentially outside partners to start looking at what a mitigation strategy that you could implement, what that's going to cost in terms of time and money, and what you expect to receive from that. So basically, it's do an assessment. We do something here at Biorasi called a trial health assessment, which is really that first step, which is really looking back at where you are now versus where you plan to be, but more importantly, where are you going to be? If you continue on this pace, this trajectory that you're at, how far off of your original projections are you going to be, and how much is that going to cost you? And then once you know that number, and that's in terms of time and money and risk, and once you know that analysis, you can start to look at different options that you have at your disposal with either internally mitigating something or actually bringing in another partner. And you need to understand at that point as well, what is that going to cost you in terms of time and risk and cost. And once you know those two variables, it should be a pretty simple equation as to whether or not this is something that should be considered. The first step is really an analysis of what are your options and how much those options are going to cost. Basically, what is your return on intervention for each of those options? And that's something that Biorasi can help with. So we're here if you want to reach out to us, and it's something that we do obviously free of charge, just as a analysis to see if there's something that we can potentially help you with. And sometimes we can't. Sometimes we'll say there's really nothing that we can do at this stage, but here are some other ideas.
Thank you. And adding to that, a question just came through. Can you give us an example on how you rescued or risk mitigated a clinical trial from your past experiences?
Sure. So I think that last slide that we had before the conclusion slide was actually a summary of 6 different rescues. So I can just pick one from there. We had one. I guess if you want some more details about it, it was a very difficult study in traumatic brain injury, and this was a study that was being run all in the U.S. And basically when the sponsor came to us, they were supposed to have recruited 52 subjects at this point in time, and they were supposed to be done with their enrollment basically. However, they'd only recruited 1, so they were a year and a half behind their original projections. And they were, of course, getting change orders and things like that for the protraction of the study and all this kind of stuff. So they were basically underwater. The study budget had already ballooned to twice the cost that was originally planned, and so they really needed a lot of help. So we came in and we implemented a ton of different strategies. We don't have time to go into each of those strategies, but you can also send me an email afterwards. We can give you some more details. But it included, basically spinning up a patient navigator group to help the patients get through the screening process. It was also obviously adding some sites in the U.S., but also adding a couple sites outside the U.S. And what we were able to do is we were able to recruit the rest of those subjects in 9 months. So we were able to recruit the rest of those 51 subjects in only 9 months and get the study finished. And when we did an analysis at the end, we actually saved this particular sponsor about $20 million. So it was a huge, success, and we're still running more studies, with them now. So it was a good experience. And there's also some, by the way, for that, there's some case studies in the materials, the references. So there's some examples there. I think this one might be one of those as well.
And how is patient confidentiality handled when the intervention requires a direct interaction with patients?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, I mean, we do this all the time. Obviously, this has to, anything that you're, you know, doing with patients has to be, scripted, and those scripts have to be reviewed and approved by the IRBs. So when we're doing, I just mentioned actually in the prior example, something like the rescue, the navigator, and that's where we actually have direct, interaction with patients. So we are using an approved script. Of course, we're not getting any, identifiable information. We're not keeping any identifiable information from the patient. We're merely directing them to the sites. And of course, the sites will have the direct interaction with the patients, and that's a whole another ball game there. But we are able to do that as part of that in our purview as a navigator in that sense. But it's important that we keep that confidentiality and that we use only IRB approved materials.
Thank you. Well, I believe we have time for a couple more questions, but please keep sending them in, and we'll make sure to follow up with you after the webinar in case we don't manage to address those questions now. How do I sell the need for a rescue to supervisors, executives, and other stakeholders?
It's another great question, and I think at times this becomes one of the most difficult things for the development team in the company on the sponsor side, because they don't want to appear as if they've failed in any way, and in fact they haven't failed. Identifying problems and then working first with the CRO to try to resolve all those problems is always the best answer. But when I had to do it, I had to actually rescue a trial in the middle of a phase 3 pivotal trial and completely switch out the CRO and come up with a plan to do that. And we were a public company, so it also became material information that. So my approach was at the time is to kind of build a case that I could present to management and the board for why I needed to do this. And then secondly, I had to have the solution in place in the logistics for that solution. And that's where you have to spend a lot of time up front. I had to actually identify the CRO that was going to come in and replace the existing CRO, and I had to come up with a plan, a timeline, and everything for actually transferring over all responsibilities eventually to the new CRO. So it really takes a lot of legwork up front, but I found that the board, the management team, and everybody appreciated the fact that we needed to do this. It was presented in a way that was clear, and there was just no other alternative actually to save this trial. And as you know, a single drug in a public company could, and if it failed in the clinical trial because of mismanagement and stuff, you could tank the whole company and a drug that could save patients' lives. So you really have to do the right thing. It's as simple as always just doing the right thing. But you have to build the case for it, and you have to present that properly and have the solution.
Thank you, Kurt. So one final question for today. Other than slow or no enrollment, what other warning signs can a sponsor spot that will highlight the need for a trial rescue?
Just a couple of things that came up were actually the red flags for me was a lack of monitoring reports. The monitoring reports were not coming in. And then there were a lot of excuses around that. And then as I started to dig in deeper, I found that the monitors were actually not even going to the sites. And I started to talk to the sites and the nurses and the PIs, and they were disappointed that this study was being poorly managed, and they hadn't seen anybody coming to the sites. So that's why I suggested you really have to also have good relationships with the sites, because they can actually, even before you don't get monitoring visits, they can let you know that you're actually having a problem with your trial as far as people being on site to do what they're supposed to be doing.
Yeah, and we went through a lot of other ones too in the previous slides, but I would say that the data cleaning progress is a really big important one to look at, because not only from the SDV perspective, but also the querying, and because that's something that could really hurt the database log timelines. And as Kurt was saying, everything's kind of driven off of your top-line analysis, especially in the small, mid-sized, pharma on what you're seeing, and that's driven by your database lock. So if you're not getting the data cleaned in a timely manner, and that's something that's so easy to look at, early on, is to see, are those things happening in real time like they should be. Another big one is like, SAE reconciliation is another easy one to look at that sometimes doesn't get so much attention. So those are just two other things that we've seen that kind of are indicative. And one final one probably is a screen fail rate, because that's a really easy one. And then, of course, we talked about the site activation timeline, right? That's the big one. The earliest, most important one to look at is how quickly are you getting the sites activated. I'd say if you had to pick one up front, I'd pick that one.
All right, well, great. So that is all the time we had for questions today. Thanks again for sending those in. And of course, a reminder to look out for an email within the next 2 hours with links to download today's material. And we would also like your feedback. So if you could take a minute to answer a very brief survey that will pop up on your screen at the end of the session, that would be very much appreciated. On behalf of Biorasi and Marcus Evans webinars, we would like to thank you all for joining us, and we do hope that you'll be listening in at our next webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.